Well, hi there, Pastor Mike, following up from the teaching from Sunday about generous with our resources as we concluded our generosity series. Really thoroughly enjoyed doing that series, and that was good. I mean, I liked going through different aspects of how we're generous, especially given the fact that it is woven into the heartbeat of the universe. And just to let you know, it is really awkward for me to talk about money from the pulpit, not because I don't think it's important, but because there's just so many stipulations with it. There's so many bad, negative experiences from people in churches, including myself, regarding money. And so it's almost, I think you might sense it if you listen to the teaching, it's like kind of walking a tightrope, if you will, in some ways. But I do want to follow up with some things. I only had one card on Sunday, and the question, and I don't have it with me right now, but basically the question was, you said that, Mike, that tithing was an Old Testament teaching, but not in the New Testament. And I said in the teaching that the New Testament teaching was more radical than that, that actually it was beyond tithing, that the idea was to give sacrificially, was the sentiment in the New Testament. But the question was, so even though that standard isn't there, is the tithing, the 10%, kind of like a minimum expectation, if you will? Great question. I think for the Jewish people, 10% was the minimum in the Old Testament. That was kind of like the minimum absolute that you would give. Now, it was a little different to them back then than it is to us now, but at the same time, that was kind of the minimum expectation. At the same time, one of the points I was making with 2 Corinthians 9 on Sunday was, I think we can get really bogged down into saying, okay, I don't give 10%, therefore I just don't give it all, because if I can't get the 10%, then why should I even do it? I don't think that's a great posture to have, because, again, one of the things that, if you remember the text we were reading, that the act of being generous with our resources and giving of our resources opens us up to more gratitude and more generosity. One story I didn't tell in the teaching was the story of the parable of the talents. And what's interesting about, kind of the way Jesus tells these stories, one of the many parables he tells about resources in the scriptures, is your wealth is not bad. A lot of people like to say having a lot of money is bad or having a lot of resources is bad. It's not. In fact, there are people who just are really good at making money. They just have a talent for it. Now, the parable of the talents is about, what do you do with the gifts that God has given you? What do you do with the talents that you do have? And so the story goes that there's a person who was given 1 talent, there's a person who's given 3, and a person given 5. And what do you do with that? And both the 3 and the 5 say, hey, I multiplied it, I doubled what the investment was, and the person with the 1 buried it in the ground. And in the parable, the manager came back to the person he gave 1 talent to, is like, you lazy person, at least put it in the bank to gain interest. So the idea behind the gifts that God has given you, again, here's the expectation. The expectation is that you actually do something with it. This is woven in the fabric of the universe, friends. If you remember way back in Genesis 1, we were talking about at the beginning of the series, God has hardwired creation to give life, to be generous, to give more. Actually, he loaded it with potential to produce more beautiful things. So it wasn't, if you think about the story of the Bible, the story starts in a garden, and in the end of the story, you end up with a city. How do you get from a garden to a city? Well, something has to happen, right? And in fact, the garden is in the city at the end of the story. So, there's a development, there's a progression, there's something that's happened. So God's like, hey, I gave you all these wonderful gifts. I gave you all these talents. I wired you a unique way. And I want you to use those things to give life to others, to bless others, to be good news to others. That's what Jesus was doing, right? That's why he called out the woman who gave everything. He's like, look, she's giving everything she has. Why? Because she gets it. She recognized that everything she has is a gift, and so she just has that kind of heart. And I think, and I told you on Sunday, for me, this is something that is continuing to be a lesson to me. I have not arrived on the least bit at all. And I did talk about the question on Sunday, and I'll follow up a little bit because I know people keep asking me, is what do you do about church? should we give money to the church? And I thought I made a pretty interesting case on Sunday, but for those of you that didn't hear it all the way through or got a chance to listen to it, I mean, here's the deal. If you consider your local church home part of your family, part of your community, if you will, yeah, there is an expectation that you are to be sharing with each other, that you're to give of your resources to your local community. What makes it difficult is the church is now institutionalized. I mean, as much as people want to deny it, it's true. And there's a lot of movements out there that have really kind of rebelled against that. That they've been so jaded by the institutional church. They say, look, let's just share our resources together and do that. And quite honestly, friends, that's also the church, right? The church is not a building, right? The church is a group of people who are furthering the gospel together, who are continuing to live a particular way with one another to show Christ in the flesh. That's the church. And so, people can get really wrapped up. It's like, well, there's all sorts of arguments. Like, I don't need to give to an institutional church that I'm a part of because that's the institution. And, it's, of course, it's, for me to make comments about this is difficult. What makes it difficult is practically, yes, my payment comes from the gifts of the people in the church community. It's an act of faith, really, for me, right? It's the idea of like, look, I am in faith, depending that the work that I'm doing currently is going to be compensated by the community for the things that I do. The hard part about that is how does that money given? What do people do in the midst of that? And that's part of relationships, right? I've had people come up to me who tell me that I should do particular things because I'm using their money. And again, we've missed the point on the posture of money. The money isn't yours, right? It's God's. And part of giving, and that's why Paul says in 2 Corinthians 9, he's like, look, I want a cheerful giver. I want you to understand that giving, period, is how I'm wired. And you think about who God is. I mean, that's the thing I want you to think about. Think about what God is like. I mean, if God was like the way I am with money sometimes, man, I'd be in trouble. And the images of God that come with that are one that, says, I expect, all this stuff in return. There is an expectation of gratitude, right? Of God's given us amazing gifts to continue to be good news to others, to continue to live the life of salvation. And that's part of this life of being generous with the resources. How many times have you given without any expectation return? And it's been like this, there's something deep inside your soul that says, that is it, right? So it makes an interesting conversation, like, should I give the money to the church? And I would just, reiterate like I did on Sunday. Listen, regardless of what people think about membership, that's a whole nother teaching. If you consider, New Ground your home, if you feel like you're part of the family, if you're invested in community, if you're in some way, shape, or form, then I think the reliable expectation is, yeah, you should be giving of your resources to the local community of the people that you care about. I mean, that's what you do with your families, right? You share. You have a family at home. Say, if you have a family, you are sharing resources with your family at home, right? I mean, there's something to that, right? My daughter, doesn't pay for everything on her own, right? She has the benefit of living in our house, but she's part of the family, so that's how it works, right? And that's kind of how we provide it. And she shares her gifts in different ways with us. It's not necessarily money, right? It's other things as well. It's kind of a mutual thing. And so it gets really touchy with people because people are like, well, I worked really hard for this, therefore. In the scriptures, it's, the consistent understanding is, look, everything is a gift. It's all God's money. So the question is, how much of God's money do you want to keep? And how much can you give? And I want to be honest with you, I feel absolutely ashamed sometimes of the money I spend selfishly, just for me. And I'm not saying spending money on yourself is bad, don't get me wrong, but it's asking questions of how am I using my resources for the kingdom? If that's not the first question on our minds, I think we have a problem. I think that's the whole point. Like when we talk about the idea of first fruits, which is a very prevalent idea in the scriptures, The idea is like the portion I'm giving, I do it first before anything else. It doesn't become the last thing on my list. Like, okay, I got all this stuff to pay and then I'll give. No, the idea is, no, I'm going to do this first and then I'm going to take care of everything else. And I tell you, friends, and I haven't been perfect at this. I mean, our family hasn't either. But man, when I've done that, man, for some odd reason, God has provided for my needs every time. That's another discernment in itself, right? What's our needs and what's our wants? God wants us to have a flourishing life. Granted, it doesn't mean God doesn't want you to have vacations. I talked about that on Sunday. But he does want us to be faithful managers of the resources that he's given us. And for some, they think I have to have a certain amount. That's the scarcity principle, friends. That's the idea. I don't have enough. If I had more, it'd be better. But friends, I told you a story about Mary Ellen on Sunday in our own community. You saw the story of the widow. There's no level of amount in God's eyes. It's a heart posture. It's all about the heart. And so for some of you might be listening to this, and maybe you can share this with others, maybe it's a challenge to you. Maybe you just haven't given to the local community before, wherever you're at. If you're part of New Ground, where you call your church home, maybe it's time to consider, you know what, maybe we need to think through this a little more. And for some, it's like, I don't know if I can give 10%. Right now, there's so much, and I get it. I'm with you. But why don't we start somewhere, right? Early on in my when I first was in college, I started with a very small amount. I started with like 3%, and it seemed really minuscule. It was, but I started with 3%. I was a poor college kid. But to start that practice, and then the next time, like maybe I can go to 4, maybe the next time I can go to 5, and I found that to be a much easier process as I went along. It doesn't mean I've been perfect at it, but that's a great place to start. And I would just challenge you in that way with your resources to consider that, especially if you consider New Ground your home. To like, hey, again, that sounds like the 1-800-NGC-GIVE sermon, right? It sounds like it. But at the same time, it's let's be real. I mean, some people just don't give because we are not good managers of our money. Now, that's a whole other issue, right? We didn't even talk about maybe we should figure out what does it look like to budget well. And there's a lot of us that struggle with that, including myself, right? Of developing a budget and sticking with it. It's discipline, right? That's all it is. Living a life intentionally. I like to call discipline intention, really, is what it is. It's not just, discipline sounds like a negative word, but it's actually intention. It's living with intention. And I think as we continue to do that, you start to see God working in incredible ways. And that's why I was inspired by the story of Mary Ellen and her intention. I mean, she's so dedicated with such little resources, but man, just the amazing things that God was doing in her life in the midst of that, and still, just incredible stuff. Anyway, I digress. So hopefully that was meaningful. Hopefully I answered some of your question. I'm really excited about the next series that we're doing starting on Sunday. Emotionally Healthy Spirituality is an area that has been significant in my life. I know I talked about it here once before when I first was here, but we're going to do a whole series on it for the next couple of months, and to really dive into the things that I think can really hold us back from growth. And I think there's a lot of connection between our spiritual maturity and emotional maturity. I think they're definitely connected. And so we're going to walk through some specific things in the series about ways that we can know ourselves. And not only know ourselves, but to wrestle with things that have a deep effect on us that maybe we're not even aware of. And I would just pray that you would have open minds and hearts as we walk into this series, because it's going to be intense. I mean, I'm not going to candy coat it. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be freeing. It's going to be a wonderful discussions I hope that you'll have in your smaller communities. It's really going to be a good one. And in the middle of that series, we're going to have our official organization service. We're going to become an official church on November 3rd. Really excited about that. Those of you who are regular attenders should have got nomination forms in the mail. We also have them online on our website at newgroundchurch.org. You can go there under the contact menu and go under nomination forms to find that documentation. We're really excited about that, electing our first consistory of elders and deacons. And there's just a lot of good things happening. Pumpkin Palooza is coming up at the end of the month. Just a lot of exciting things on the horizon. So, hey friends, it's great to talk with you this week. I look forward to seeing what happens in the new series, and we'll see you Sunday. In the meantime, grace and peace.